think that's something that probably resonates with a lot of people here. But thinking about narratives as one of the things that hold ideas about people and issues in place. So proactively kind of supporting the status quo to remain as it is. And when narratives start to get challenged, there's always a reaction, right? So it's like a kind of your physics kind of game. And narratives are powerful because they connect our kind of inner and our outer worlds. So just as much as sort of storytelling kind of is an activator for human beings, and there's so much written about that, and we all know it as communicators. We studied it probably, we do it every day. The values that Jennifer was mentioning before, how we activate certain types of narratives through our work. But they also act as sort of shortcut for our brains. They're sort of like a code almost, where they enable us, sort of the stories and the larger narratives that they feed into enable us to make sense of the world, not necessarily always logically. It's also important to mention. And this work started for me with this idea or this sort of hypothesis or this question of that I was seeing, and well, also my organization was seeing that stories and narratives are being used to close the space to speak out. And actually, we can think about how that happens also within the development sector around certain narratives that we've mentioned. So when someone says, oh, hang on a second, I'm actually not okay with the way that you're talking about this, or I really disagree with this particular framing of this, what happens to those individuals? Because they are also challenging power relations that are quite set in stone in our sector as well, ways of doing things that have been there for a really long time. And so what I'm really interested in thinking about as well is like not just looking at the negative side of narratives, but also at the positive side of narratives. So how can narrative thinking and framing knowledge be utilized better to open spaces for dialogue, just like the one that we're here in today. And something that I found, so I'm going to share a couple of little visuals now. You'll notice from this presentation that I'm very visual. And for me, the visual narratives is also another area of work. So narratives are not just something that are written or in a story. Those might be the most familiar ones, but they're also visual. And we have a few people on the call, I think, who are experts in that area as well. But they're also made up of not just of what we say, but also what we do. And that's important to really hold on to, because narratives are also created by our behavior. And I think we can think about that in different ways. And there is four I've put here, reasons that narrative work has become so much more critical now, interlocking kind of things. So the advance of technology aided isolation and manipulation that we've been seeing, kind of, the first sort of most visible scandal around Cambridge Analytica, but it was by no means the only one. It was just the one that was unearthed. The rise of nationalism, patriarchy, and national supremacy, kind of the combination of those. And here you have the tiki torches, which became a kind of symbol of exactly that combination of things. The rise of regressive populist leaders and anti-rights movements, and the kind of challenges that poses also for our sector, and then the spread of misinformation, disinformation, what is otherwise known as fake news. And I think it's useful to just have this as a kind of framework for thinking about narratives beyond just communications, but again, thinking about it as ways of operating, ways of working together, collective action, and how to build power in a way that doesn't feed into or actually use any of the same kind of tools and techniques that we're seeing kind of coming at us from these four different quadrants. So I'm going to ask for some volunteers in a second as well to help me kind of dissect a couple of the narratives that we've shared. But first I wanted to share a visual, something I drew a couple of years back, thinking about kind of why delegitimizing stories, frames and labels, so also we can think of stereotypes, falling into this bracket, but a lot of the work that I've been doing has focused on narratives that close the space to speak out for specific groups in society. So human rights defenders, social movements, organizations, activists, etc. And what we see in that process, and so it's seen this kind of across the board, and we can think about how this applies within the sector as well. So again, going back to this idea of what happens when you challenge dominant narratives that are at play, well, you get undermined. So I think this is maybe something that some of us on the call have experienced perhaps quite directly. When you say, hey, I have an issue with the way that we're presenting this, or I think that this is not a very inclusive way of presenting this issue, or actually this is really propagating very problematic narratives about certain groups. Do we want to look at the subtext of what we're trying to say here, not just at the surface? People get undermined, and actually stories are created about them. So difficult woman, or so on. Someone who doesn't play by the rules. And there are lots of labels that get attached to people who challenge power. So I think this is something that we can think about. And maybe I wanted to ask everyone, if you feel comfortable, it doesn't necessarily need to be one that you received yourself, but one that you maybe have heard that challenged the kind of the challenger, if you like, that actually sought to undermine the legitimacy of the person who was raising the issue. And we see this a lot around also whistleblowing, which is kind of something that is very current right now in our sector. The way that whistleblowers are treated is also part of this. So it's almost looking at the civic space that we have within the development sector to speak out on issues. Just wanted to share this also as another tool. So if people would like to share some of the kind of delegitimizing stories or frames that they have heard around specific instances, it would be really interesting to hear that, and we can kind of come back to this and dig a little bit deeper. So this is kind of like known as, I call it the castle. So we've got some coming in on the chat now. Oh yeah, Karen. Yeah. So Joanne, do you want to just say a little bit about this particular one? And
yeah, so I mean, you'd have to be living under a rock not to have heard of this new kind of I suppose it's kind of like an insult to call someone a Karen, which I guess it's come from women, I guess, in their middle age, who are no longer afraid to complain or say when they're unhappy about something. But also, I get the impression that there are, there is a big group of people that take it too far, and like making someone's life and their day hell by like complaining unfairly, especially when they're dealing with service providers. But actually, so maybe it's come from a place that that makes sense. But really, if you go on Facebook and you look in the comments, if a woman particularly says something that other people don't agree with, or they're unhappy, or they complain about something, they instantly at the moment get labeled a Karen. And I just feel like it's just sexist, and no one is really challenging that at the moment, because to challenge the use of the word Karen kind of makes you look like a Karen, maybe. And it just feels so unfair. And at the beginning, it didn't occur to me, but yeah, go on, sorry.
Sorry, Joanne. I just want to offer a little context from the origins of Karen that does come from my context. And it is really about racialized entitlements. So it is specifically about white women making people's of color's jobs really difficult.
Yeah, no, I get that, but now when you look on Facebook, so for example, there was a woman in the local village who was like, oh, there were crowds of hikers walking up the hill this weekend. It was really annoying when we're supposed to be staying in our local area. And all the comments were like, oh, what a Karen. Oh, Karen, go back home, kind of thing. So it's moved away from the original kind of context, I guess. And it feels like another way of getting at women and labeling women.
So it has lots of layers to it, right? And I think this is going to take us into the next exercise. And different types of resonance in different places. And I think this is really interesting because it's whether it's sort of deeply rooted in a particular context or it translates itself globally, and what happens when it loses that kind of deeper significance that Jennifer was just mentioning. You know, the way it's being applied, what gives it power, do you think, in either of those contexts? I don't know, Jennifer, if you want to add something on this as well.
Sorry, I was in the chat. My colleague was saying labels are very powerful in that way, right? And unfortunately, I know many people named Karen. Their parents loved them and gave them the name Karen. So there's a layer. And so it is an expression of frustration that is not necessarily individualized, but that often gets expressed in interpersonal ways. And so this is the tricky part of where we are right now too, is we've got to see structural and institutional aspects of how power gets organized, and then how that actually plays out between us as well. And those two things are very much related often.
Yeah, so I think if we kind of think back to that kind of those interlocking squares of interlocking squares of doom, basically, you in different places, different elements of those are coming to life. And I think it's Joanne's just shared a kind of additional thing that in the UK it's particularly being used to really sort of just shut down conversations, and I think it's probably very closely connected to cancel culture as well. There's another one in the chat which I really like. Lucia, do you want to say a little bit about this, as in like kind of around idealism and labeling people young people as idealists?
Yeah, I can. I've joined this young political movement. It's a pan-European movement in Europe because they want to really try and set down a new way of doing politics, really focusing on having conversations and dialogues rather than having, talking heads that toe the party line. And this is a really young movement across Europe. And whenever, and I see the same thing is done with the Fridays for the Future movement that Greta Thunberg started. So these are all young people, and they are so well versed. They really know what they are about. They really want to go for something new and try to make change happen, and they're doing it while they're at it, right? Yeah. So it's not just talk. They're really doing things, incredible things. But whenever you try to talk about these kind of movements with others and what they stand for, it's like it gets this label of the young idealists, and they haven't seen anything, and it totally blocks any interest in what these young people are standing for and what they're trying to do. And I really feel that they are going to lead the way. I mean, we're in this mess because of who we are today, and this I see this a lot, and I now experience it myself. So although I'm not young, but I've joined this young movement, and it's like very, immediately people have this idea that, it's a young movement and therefore it's idealist and therefore it won't work.
Yeah. Kind of. Again, to shut down somebody who's challenging power. Yeah. And I think this is something that, we're just going to get into now. I hope you can see the next slide, which is sort of looking below the surface. So this is an iceberg. You've seen loads of icebergs. I think icebergs are the most memed thing this year as far as explaining different social interactions. I love it because it tells you, it's been so memed because for a reason it's meaningful for a lot of people. And this one is particularly, it's a tool that I've used a couple of times, just digging into what lies below the surface. It's quite simple, really. And I've put a little example that one of the young activists that I've been working with, Elena Mejia Hurga, had shared with me, which was happening in response to and you can go and find out more about this kind of the power approach that's behind this from Jas as well, but I've adapted it for narratives. So thinking about kind of, if we look at the incident or the label or the attack or the narrative itself, the story that we're trying to understand, like it's always connected below the surface, just like a little bit out of view, but enough for you to understand that it's connected to something larger. And the example here we've got is actually related to youth activism fighting inequality in Peru. And so I'll just work through the different layers, and obviously it's not a precise science, so it's more of a tool to kind of get you to go deeper and deeper and deeper about what is it that really sits at the root of the narratives that we're dealing with, and then we'll work through one that is going to be shared. So the story here is basically civil society lives off the poverty of the people, and that's a pretty grim story to be dealing with, right? So like, but it's one that Elena's heard many, many times. And again, if we think about narratives being many, many stories that kind of together make something a kind of a truth that is held in society, then thinking about what are the different stereotypes and prejudices that are packed into this little story. So we have things like parasite on the weakest in society. That's one element of this story. That activists are the problem, that the activists and social change actors are lazy and anti-entrepreneurial, which is sort of basically like anti-national effectively, because these things are very closely connected to Peruvian kind of culture. And that people ultimately are poor because they want to be. And somebody mentioned this, I think, earlier in terms of toxic narratives that we see kind of around our work. And then thinking even deeper below that, sort of basically that fundamentally social work, anything that delivers a society or seeks to change stuff is unproductive and corrupt. And below that, change is not possible. So this is where like this particular narrative, this particular story gets its power from. And I think it's useful to think about kind of what lies beneath the narratives that we're looking at, to be able to understand, okay, well, there's a reason that this is so entrenched. There's a reason that I'm finding it so difficult to shift, partly because I think sometimes we have this, we have to change everything. And when it doesn't change immediately, we can get frustrated or disillusioned. But also because it helps you to see the web of interconnected power that lies beneath some of these, gives them so much resonance and makes them very easy to believe. And ultimately helps us to understand what we're really up against, which takes us to this idea that collective action around messaging, or collective action around values, is really the only way you can go to disrupt power relations. And I can go into a bit more about some nice examples of creative means to do that in a second. But I'm wondering, maybe we want to pick a narrative, or pick a story, or pick an incident, and delve a little bit deeper. And I'm going to ask if there are any two people who'd like to be volunteers to help me to do that. You can just raise your hand either physically or with the little button in the chat. Okay, so we've got Sonia. Great. Anyone else? I can't see anybody else. Come on, one more volunteer. It's gonna be really fun. Joan, can I volunteer you, because you're like, yeah?
And we have Christine.
Oh, Christine, great. Perfect.
Sorry,
okay.
I couldn't figure out the raise hand button.
Oh, no worries. I was like, I'm all on my own here. So let's think about one of the narratives that, Christine, I'm going to just pick a story that you want to kind of dig a bit deeper, maybe one of the ones that was shared earlier, or maybe you came with some particular toxic narratives that are present in your work or in your environment, and what we see in your work.
I guess it might be that poor people can't speak for themselves. And the way my organization has framed that in the past, less so now, thank God, but we give them a voice.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Ouch. Yeah.
Okay, let's dig into this a little bit, because it's quite a juicy one, I think. Mm-hmm. So if we think of like the message as being kind of the top of the iceberg, so the most visible part. So poor people can't speak for themselves or don't know how to speak for themselves or something along those lines. The story, I think, and maybe we can ask Sonia, is this something that you've also seen kind of in, not necessarily in your work, but in the sector? And what for you lies at that level below? Like what's the thing that lies below that gives it so much power?
So I work at, I'm assuming this is a safe space, so this has to be sort of confidential, I guess in some ways, but you can't control what people say. I have been working at MSF for a few years, and when you talk about this them culture, poor people can't speak for themselves, the way I would relate it to within the organizational context that I am currently in is frankly is this colonial attitude that you get, because something like MSF is very Eurocentric, and what we're struggling with is the us versus them, global South, global North, we are the ones who have the tools to be able to save the situation, to make this better, versus assuming that's something that the country can actually do on its own. So if I'm trying to relate what Christine just said to the environment that I'm in, this is what I'm struggling with.
Yep.
This is what I'm seeing. And in addition to that, just the basic acknowledgement of the fact that this exists, that this attitude exists and is not fully acknowledged by the people that need to acknowledge it, is even worse. That makes it harder, because you can't really address a problem if somebody doesn't think there's a problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. This really reminds me of something I think Maria shared at some point, who's also on the call, around how can you decolonize something that's inherently colonial?
Yeah. Absolutely right.
I didn't promise we were going to have loads of answers in this session, but I think it's a good space to have to raise the question. And I think that's for me, when I hear you say that, Sonia, it also reminds me also of something that someone else said, I think earlier in the chat, around who has knowledge and what knowledge counts, and where does that sit?
And somebody else also said about, I think there was a commenter about power. If there are people who have the ability to change, change or steer the organization in a certain direction because of the virtue of the titles and the roles that they play, then they need to be the ones who need to be the most educated in this. Because there's only that much a person like me keeps raising up her voice, but I'm always on the periphery, never at the table, never in the glass bowl, to be able to say, change this.
Yeah.
So you always find yourself begging and pleading to be heard, or simply that what you're saying is true and needs to be acknowledged.
May I jump? I didn't catch your name. This is Christine, but I can tell you that I've been at my organization for 10 years. And what I found is that it's often leadership that just doesn't want to hear it. Which is, yeah, but I have just don't stop. Don't stop, because you're moving the needle whether you know it or not. But it's hard. It's such a hard place to be that person who's like, no, this is not okay. And
so the other thing, Christine, is that even if they are willing to hear it, what you want to know is the difference between hearing and listening. Mm-hmm. Are they paying lip service to it? Because there could be people who would say, yes, I completely agree with you, etc., etc. And then what? Right. Then what? What is being said in these organizational discussions? Are they truly conveying the meaning of what you're trying to help them realize? So.
Well, what I've seen is if you keep doing it long enough, then they sort of come to think it's their idea.
This is a really interesting tactic on how to disrupt power, right? Like it's like
Survive it.
But I think the other part of this, and there's a reason that these two anthologies are called Narrative Power and Collective Action. Like it's very difficult to change these things on your own. And I think that's why spaces like this are so critical. And I want to see many, many more discussions like this, because, you know, it's very hard to go out with any kind of intentionality to shift narratives, to change what is known, if you aren't willing to first go inside and actually look at what narratives you are responsible for propagating and pushing. And I think sometimes what I found, at least with, and it's also why we have an anthology of different perspectives and different voices that really raise this issue to the fore, is that sometimes it's actually stronger to bring in those voices of others and say, well, this is what I'm hearing. You know, do we continue as is, or do we go a different route? And I think that's where the kind of creative potential for collaboration within our sector really comes from as well, because it's very difficult to say anything externally if you aren't able to sort of say, at least you've got your crew or your, you know, others, that kind of collective power piece as well.
Okay.
I think for me, but
Joan, go for it. Yeah.
Sorry, just to jump in, because we are about 4 minutes to the hour, and we just want to invite those who would like to stay on, because we had an ambitious agenda today, and it's getting really interesting, and we're very grateful for that it's also very useful. But we just want to invite those who are able to stay on for at least another 30 minutes. Or 15 to 30 minutes, and those who have to go, you're welcome to exit as well. But there was somebody who had something to say just before I jumped in. Please continue.
I think it was me, but I forgot my point.
Isabel, we have a question from Anna in the chat that I think would take us back to the model. And Anna is asking, so to respond to an incident, let's say there is a flashpoint, there's leaders taking some kind of visible action. I'm going to stay with this concept, but do you need in the deep narratives in your response to the incident?
Isabel, you're on mute.
I muted. Sorry.
Fine, it's all good.
Sorry. I was like, I will not do it this time, but I did. So I think this is a really good question. You don't have to. So I'm not here to present like a kind of, it's just one tool that I've found really useful for talking with others about what lies beneath some of the kind of incident stories that we hear, and unpacking and unpicking that power, those power dimensions. I think actually in practice, it probably makes your life a bit harder, right? Like it doesn't, like to see what you have not previously seen, because it starts to make visible a web of things that are around you that are quite frankly probably out of your control and influence. But the reason that I think it is useful to kind of make a connection and a deeper analysis is that it helps you to be a little bit clear about what is the actual problem. So like, rather than say, oh, this sentence feels a bit iffy, you actually can share, okay, well, I've like really gone a little bit deeper, and this is why I think it's maybe problematic. It gives you, I think, a little bit more maybe legitimacy, perhaps. It provides a little bit more evidence, potentially, of the things that you are kind of challenged by. So for me, I personally think, yes, it is more useful to have a bit of an analysis of why. It helps you to answer that question of why is this problematic, which is often the response that you'll get first off by like somebody, you know, if you're saying, actually, this is really, really difficult, we can't be saying something like this, and it helps you to go a little bit deeper with the why. And I think that this tool also enables you to do that with other people, because that's also part of this work, right? So like, again, if you're challenging or questioning leadership, for example, or anyone who has more power than you, you know, it's really useful to not be doing that, I think, on your own. Maybe you feel really confident and that you totally got it, but usually it's good to do this with others. And if you bring in others to do that analysis of the deep narratives that sit below what you're finding problematic, then it's also a collectively owned analysis, which again adds greater legitimacy and also I think adds greater texture, because you're just looking at it from your perspective, which you have from your personal experiences, things that you've gone through, and someone else might look at that from a really different perspective. And this is also why I really kind of push for doing these analysis with a diverse group, because there's going to be people in that room who see stuff that you are not able to see. So yeah, just to respond to that.
And there's a comment in the chat from Sveta about we can't possibly be doing anything wrong. We do good, right? That shadow of doing good in which we sweep all these things. But we've had, as a sector, continual wake-up calls, undeniable, big media attention wake-up calls. So what do you think, Isabel, is the narrative in the public realm, in the deeper narrative, that supports behavior in which we're just like, well, we do good and we have good intentions, so that's enough? What is the public hold that allows that to happen? What, you know what I'm saying? What are the mental models the public holds that allows that to happen?
Well, I think it's a mental model that we've given them, right? Because we've presented our work as good. Like, so that's not an accident. And we continue to present our work as good. It's also why the scandals are all the more shocking, right? And this, you put yourself on a pedestal, you have a lot further to fall, I think. Yeah, it's, and I think that there is what I see at least, and it's not necessarily a direct answer, apologies for that. I know it's really annoying when people do that in calls, you're just like, you're not answering the question. You have to understand the power dynamics at play. So if, for example, the issue that you're talking about, I don't know, relates to workplace bullying, or it relates to, you know, colonial behavior, there's a vested interest to keep that kind of under wraps, because that's just like, if our brand is built on us doing good, then to be seen publicly or otherwise to be not doing that is really deeply problematic. And that's where there's a real quite quick line to the challenges of our fundraising models for a lot of organizations, and the role that communications plays in that. And so often communicators are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, I think, on this. And again, I would go back to, this is something that you try to do with other people. You know, it's, yeah. I don't know if you have a follow-up. Go ahead.
I think you brought up a really, really good point on workplace bullying and professional targeting, because I think that happens in several degrees, in various degrees and in various shapes and sizes. It isn't always a power struggle. Sometimes it could be between peers as well. And I've seen a lot of that happen, and I'm beginning to form a sort of a picture around it, where I think it is a combination of behavior that's been tolerated, just simply tolerated because of poor, what do you call it, tools provided to management and weak HR. And I think that part of I'm just picking up on one of your points, because I've been thinking a lot about workplace bullying and professional targeting as well. And I think part of it is going to have to come with anybody who's willing to educate people on the effects of bullying and targeting, on the effects of what it costs the organization to have to address it, on the consequences of what a manager needs to be able to do in a situation like this, rather than putting it under wraps, is something that you know, we're going to have to keep doing. And I find myself having to, you know, send articles, send TED Talks to HR, to the managers, to see this is what's happening. You see, with this situation, these are the kinds of things you have to do. So sorry you went on a rant there, but I really did want to, I was just typing workplace and bullying as you were talking, Isabel.
Isabel, there's a couple. Thanks, Sonia. Sorry, there's a couple of questions which are also coming up in the chat. Anna Martinez asking, how do others guard against feeling disheartened when seeing the narrative and deep narratives that we don't have within our control?
I see a lot of nodding heads to that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. I'm not going to say that's an easy situation to be in. And I mean, how do you stay disheartened? I wonder if others have suggestions also on this from the call, like how do people stay motivated in the face of, because it's clearly just all around us, right? So like I have my ways. I'm happy to share some with you, but perhaps others also have some suggestions as well.
Yeah, I asked the question. On the one hand, I'm going, oh, this is going to be like to just pause when an incident happens, and the incident, when you're trying to speak truth to power or you're challenging a narrative, often feels really personal. And so I find something really lovely about this to stop, pause, and do the analysis and find what the deep narrative below it is and go, oh yeah, it's not about me. It's totally not about me, right? And so that gives me some heartening of like breathing space of like, oh, maybe I can set that down and I can reclaim my positive space, right? So it's like, okay, I can see that. And then the other side of me immediately is like, but crap, look at that deep narrative, right? Like we fundamentally don't think we can change, or we fundamentally, like it's so big and so rooted that it feels immovable. And then I just kind of like, yeah, like, I don't know, then depression hits. I mean, it just sort of is this storm. And so what I'm hearing from you is this reminder of we don't do this alone, we don't do this alone, we don't do this alone. And so I guess like at the very minimum is like, Anna, put your butt in the chair and come once a month to this, right? Like keep connecting. Like what are the ways in which I can not do it alone? And also I'm thinking about the poem that we started with, The Power of Words, that on the one hand, we don't do it alone. On the other hand, we do have our part to offer. And so continuing to say, like, maybe I do address the deep narrative and I put my drop in the bucket and then connect with others, but that my words do have power, even if it's not enough to change it all in one, I at least do my part. So I guess those are my thoughts, but I struggle with this a lot. I often end up in a dark, angry space. I feel really angry about it. And I know that anger doesn't attract, right? Like that's not the way to say like, come join me. No one wants to come join you in your anger. And so, yeah, I have really struggled with that particularly over the last year, and would love to hear what others are experiencing.
I would throw in there self-care. This is Christine. Self-care is an amazing and powerful thing. And I was reminded of that recently when I was just so burnt out. And then I was asked to bring a poem to the all staff meeting. And I'm just like, you know.
Did you take Beowulf?
No, I brought a Mary Oliver poem, but also Elizabeth Anderson's praise song for the day, which, as it happens, was read at Obama's first inauguration. But my point is, though, that spending just a couple of hours wandering around in this wilderness of poetry cleared my mind and sort of brought my heart back and brought me back to a little bit of health and air. And so that's one really valuable thing. And another thing is work on your younger colleagues and share with them good stuff like the things that we're learning about in this conversation. Because I'm with Child Fund, used to be Christian Children's Fund. Remember Sally Struthers? So this is where we're coming from. And my younger colleagues who are in communications are like, yeah, solidarity, and so you can kind of build a movement within your own organization as well.
Yeah, and Maria also adds, some reminders that help her to get along: collective care, community friendships, relying on other people's spaces of contention, sharing outside of work, and surrounding yourself with people who are doing inspiring things that help you transform anger into motivation. Yeah. Isabel, did you want to add also some of the things that have helped you?
Yeah, so for me, like I mean, this might sound, but talking to, yeah, friends, family, always a good one, I think. I get it depends where you get your energy from. I get my energy from conversations. Some people get depleted by conversations, but you know, be that kind of going out and having chats with people, or just finding, I know I have my people who I get my go-tos for different types of issues that I'm facing in my work, and who and some of them are on the call today, but who, you know, at some certain moments where I've lost my inspiration or lost my moment, my kind of my momentum, have helped me kind of pull it back out again. And what I do is I remember to pay that forward. Because when you have inspiration, you have no idea how much meaning that can provide to somebody else who is in a dark spot. And actually then you kind of create this little chain reaction of like uplifting rather than downward spiral. So that's something that for me has been very, very meaningful over the course of, just as long as I can remember, pretty much. And I think then also just getting into creative stuff. So like if you're, a lot of our work is really focused on communicating. So we're really clear on messaging, we're getting stuff out there, we're producing like nobody's business, you know, we're very productive, right? But like taking a second to stop, going and what people have mentioned, poetry here, art, another one, you know, going and really listening to something that you haven't listened to, going and talking to someone you haven't spoken to in a while. All of these things are really good ways to also kind of like just keep strong in some manner, but also being okay with being weak, right? So like it's not just about trying to kind of constantly be our, like, you know, social justice warriors or whatever. Like you also need to be able to give your self space to also just feel how you feel, and recognize that also tomorrow it might look different. And so that's like my other number one lesson is like, don't shoot off the email when you're really pissed off. Like just take a second, think about it, sleep on it, look at it tomorrow, and I don't always follow my advice, but I try to.
Yeah,
but that's also a good one.
Yeah, it's a good reminder for sure. Permission to rest and permission to just to take a break. And Sonia also mentions meditation has also helped her 10 times a day, and that allows her to speak from a truer space. Shweta has a question, and I'm assuming that your question has something to do with what we're talking about, so I'm gonna let you ask.
Thanks, Joan. Sorry, I wasn't sure what was the protocol for the group, and I didn't want to interrupt because everyone's been making really relevant and really useful points. Just to kind of to the point that Anna was making around sort of those that are addressing those narratives, and I just completely agreed with lots of the things that people said here. Definitely the take a night to sleep on it approach is really helpful. But one thing I also found, and it may be more to do with my personality type, so it may not work for others, but I like to basically what I call do my homework. So when I kind of hear one of these things that's absolutely sort of really sort of soul destroying, I quite like to kind of research to find like a counter narrative or a good news story or a something which there's someone has put something out somewhere. You know, it could be small, it could be really, it could be just totally localized to my neighborhood, like volunteering, or it could be like a massive big thing, like, you know, the Argentina's women's movement and the great successes they've just had recently, for example. You know, so there's all different scales to it. And I find that sort of some of those things I really like, you know, those stories always have, you know, there's maybe one person, but it could be there's so many other people involved in it, which makes me always feel like someone somewhere is kind of making inroads, and while today I kind of feel defeated, someone else has got the flag up and I find those are good. But also if I'm having a discussion with someone else who sort of, you know, and I'm not feeling great and they're like, well, actually it's this and this and it's all doom and gloom, I feel like the story is also something that I can also use as kind of almost sort of like a backing for my position, or why I still think, you know, we shouldn't give up, even though I feel dispirited. So I kind of feel it helps me also kind of make the case. And it's not my case, it's actually something great, something someone else did, to be honest. So I think that's one of my tactics I've used. But it's really difficult to dredge to find the good stuff, because a lot of news narrative is focused on catastrophizing excessively on sort of the bad news things, as it were. So that was my tip.
I think this is so one of the other tools that I haven't had the chance to mention here, but I love using, is also this idea of mosaic. So like stories being the narrative tiles, the tiles in a narrative mosaic. And then thinking about it just from a numbers perspective, right? So like if you're dealing with like multiple stories that are really holding together this dominant narrative in your context, whatever that working context is, how do you create an alternative mosaic that can really start to displace some of those stories and ultimately that narrative? And I'm just about to share a really useful set of tips from a great pair of people who have talked a lot about how to go from megaphone to mosaic in terms of our communications approaches as human rights organizations. And so, you know, how do you also shift some of our organizations, which is connected to the point you were just making, from a kind of, we're going to hop on our high horse of justice and charge with our lance of truth and tell everyone what to do, which, let's be honest, no one likes in their own life. So why would you like it done at you as an organizationally? But actually thinking more about how our communications and our work can be part of creating that alternative mosaic. And that's where I think the collective action piece also can come in, and where doing things, not just don't do things on your own, but the benefits of doing things with others. You know, from a motivational perspective, as much as a networking perspective, as much as a, you know, soul building perspective. You know, I think that's what also these kinds of spaces are exactly for as well.
Yeah, I think there's some very subtle ways when we recognize our own energy that we're coming with, which is this convincing, this has to change, ardent energy. Like in English, there's just some small word changes that have helped me calm it down. Mm-hmm. So from should to could, changes everything. From must to will, and be a question. Will you join us? Will you dare to imagine it could be different? And Monica, you had asked about positive narratives within this. And I think we're out of this time where it's very difficult. There's a lot of debate right now about how to counter dangerous and damaging narratives. And we know from cognitive psychology that our brains look for what's wrong because we're trying to stay alive. We're trying to keep the group alive. So our brains that's the beautiful, horrible part of our analytical capacity, is that we're looking for what's wrong. And so for me, there's something here for us to think about as communicators around what's visceral, right? Like what we see these autocratic and despot leaders using very visceral words, very visceral rhetoric, right? That is very simple. And it's easy for people on the left to say, well, it's complicated. Well, guess what? That's not getting through to people. So what is it? What is the thing that we can create that is still visceral, but is actually, from Healing Solidarity's perspective, what is the invitation to heal? What is the invitation to reconnect what has been broken? Is a big question for me with regards to what are the positive narratives that are needed in this moment. It's maybe you don't have to work 70 hours a week to survive like why do you only take a week off between Christmas and New Year's? Like in my context, we're just asking, like introducing the idea that it doesn't have to be this way is very disruptive.
Yeah. One of the things that Jennifer, just on this, one of the things I learned from a great friend and colleague of mine, actually, she's in one of the anthologies, second volume, Alejandra, and she talks about just how the power of questions and how just raising a question or dropping a little seed of doubt can really destabilize what otherwise appears to be completely impenetrable hegemonic narratives. And I think this really applies both internally to organizations as well as out externally in the real world as well. So the power of questioning, the power of opening space for maybe alternative perspectives, where there is only otherwise a kind of almost monoculture, if you like, of opinion, can be really, really radical. And it doesn't involve much. It's a question. So it's really, this is a really useful example of it as well.
Absolutely. And who said disruption was going to be easy? I mean, we're trying to push up against power. The idea that that should go smoothly, that comes from some deep ass privilege, people. Sorry, but it does. And when you are in community with movement leaders around the world, they are the same person in the meeting with the public official as they are with their home place people and their fellow organizers, as they are with a funder. They're the same people. So my challenge to all of us is, are we the same people in every context? Are we so rooted in who we are and what we're up to that we're holding the line within ourselves all the time? So with that, I think let's, because Isabel, you rounded us off so perfectly on living the questions, asking the questions, living the questions. That's what this space is exactly for. And I just want to thank you so much for being here the last 2 months, and to all of you for being part of it. This was so wonderful. And like we always say, it never ends. These are very alive questions within us. So keep asking them. I'll put in the chat the link for our next month's event. It will happen on the 10th of February at the same time. Please feel free to invite friends and colleagues. We'd love to have you here. If you have any suggestions for upcoming guests, we'd be more than happy to have suggestions for that. And thank you so much. It's just been a pleasure. Great to see you all.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And we look forward to seeing you again on February. Yeah, and in case, the names for possible guests just pop into your mind in the course of the week, please feel free to reach out on Twitter as well. Yeah.
Yeah, happy to have you here.
Everyone, take care.